deputy, and they kept him in a motel room for 3 days. And then, lo and behold, after he was in the motel room for 3 days, he signed a typewritten confession. Of course, Benny couldn't read or write, so that was also suspect. The fact that someone would have to read him the confession in order for him to sign it. And, it came out later on that he was beaten up, promised money, all that sort of stuff, and then eventually they just wore him down, and he signed this typewritten confession. But once the autopsies were completed, they were Benny's best friend, because his whole story went right out the window as soon as the physical evidence came forward.
This reminds me so much of the Starved Rock murders, with Chester Wigger, where except the difference is we don't give Chester Wigger a break because his story actually added up, and this guy didn't.
Exactly. Yeah, this one was totally. The interesting thing about the coroner's inquest is that Loretta didn't buy Benny Bedwell's story for a minute, because it didn't. I mean, Benny's story was basically that him and another guy, he made up the name Frank. They ended up finding out that Frank was actually, what was his name? William Willington, I think. But what happened was that his story was that him and this guy Frank would met the girls, took them out dancing, partied with them for like a month, going to movies, drinking, dancing, having consensual sex. And we're talking about, a 15 and a 13-year-old girl who were probably the most sought-after people in the country once it became national news. I don't think two guys that, that would, see the paper would be like, hey, everyone and their brother's looking for these two. Let's go to a movie, or let's go dancing, or let's, check into a hotel room, or, it just didn't add up. And the mother didn't buy it for a second, because the girls didn't drink. The girls didn't go out with guys as far as she knew. And so she thought that it was actually, she was actually angry with the Cook County Sheriffs because she believed that they were really damaging the reputation of her girls. And so during the coroner's inquest, she actually sat with the mother of Benny Bedwell in the coroner's inquest and held her hand and told her, I don't believe for a second that your son had anything to do with this. So it was a pretty powerful photograph that I have of the two mothers holding hands during the coroner's inquest. So
it's an odd thing, because I think that's the person that most people think of with this whole thing, and but there are so many others. Before we get to the one that you liked for it, talk a little bit about some of the other just randoms that popped up along the way.
Well, I mean, Benny Bedwell was the only one actually charged. There were other people that were. I mean, there were a bunch of people that were brought in for questioning and then released. But they didn't really make the news all that much. It would be, just they would bring in every sex offender that they had on record, and they would bring them in and interview them about the Grimes case. So there were plenty of people interviewed. I think there were thousands of interviews having to do with this case, tens of thousands of interviews. Now, there weren't any real bona fide suspects after, or serious suspects that they brought in after Benny Bedwell. So a lot of the names people hear about didn't come out until much later, except for the one that I happened to cross by accident, and that was I was writing a story. It was a chapter in the first book that I wrote, which was Chicago's Haunt Detective. So my publisher wanted Chicago ghost stories that had some involvement with the police because of my background, and the Grimes sisters was one of those cases, just because there's some ghost stories associated with the area where the girls were found. And as I was doing the research for that book, it was really weird because I was the hairs stood up on the back of my neck when I came across this guy named Charles Melquist, and he was actually a suspect at the time, although his name really wasn't out there. I had never heard of it. I had been doing research for a couple of months, and the name never came up. But then the more and more I looked into it, he was a guy who was charged with the murder of Bonnie Lee Scott in 1958. And so as I'm reading the details, And I didn't look up Charles Melquist. I was basically trying to look at up all child murders in the mid-50s, thinking, it's a good possibility that, whoever did the Grimes case probably didn't stop there, and there may have been other crimes committed that were similar. And so I just kind of put out a generic search, and that's when I came up with Melquist. And it was so freaky that I actually made contact with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and it was really the phone call was really funny because I felt weird because I felt like they're going to think I'm crazy, but so I just called up, left a message with the secretary at the State's Attorney's Office, and I said, my name's Ray Johnson, and I'm a retired cop, and I came across some information on an old cold case that might be able to help, and that was the only message, and they said, okay, we'll have someone call you back. And it was probably a day later when a gentleman by the name of John O'Connor had contacted me, and he was an investigator with the State's Attorney's Office, and he said, is this Ray Johnson? I said, yes, it is. And he was just John O'Connor from the State's Attorney's Office. I think I know what case you're talking about. And I said, I never mentioned in my message what case I was calling about. And he said, is it the Grimes case? And I was like, okay, that's weird. I said, why of all the different unsolved murders did you think it was that one? And he said, I think it was kind of the tone of voice maybe you used, when you left the message with the secretary, and she kind of passed along, and I kind of figured that's what it was. And I said, that's really strange. So we met, and I gave them the information I had on Melquist, and at first they were like, no, he's dead, and I said, no, he's not actually, he's still alive. And they were like, really? And I said, yeah. And I met with Chicago. There was a gentleman from the Chicago Police Department, their cold case group, and also the State's Attorney's Office. And they looked him up, and they said, wow, he is still alive. And, he was given 99 years for the Bonnie Lee Scott case in 1958. So I think everyone just kind of forgot about him, figured, he's in prison, he'll never be out again. But he only did like 8 years for that crime. Which I thought was really strange. But he killed a 15-year-old girl, Bonnie Lee Scott, in 1958, left on the side of the road, very similar to the fashion the girls were left, and nude, not far from where the Grimes girls were left. And there's a whole bunch of other strange things that come with Melquist that kind of, stood out to me. But the thing about that is that he there's no way he acted alone. There's no way, based on what I've learned about how Barbara was and how Petey were, that one guy would be able to kill two girls without leaving any marks. And that was the thing with the cases, that after the autopsy was done, they never really had a cause of death other than exposure to the elements. Basically, their death certificates say homicide, but it said due to secondary shock due to low temperatures. So basically, they're just saying the girls froze to death is all they could really point to.
I mean, I guess for me, that's even hard to figure out how that would happen. I guess you could incapacitate them and then they would freeze. That would have to be. I know it gets really cold in Chicago. I get that. But
right, Travis. But I mean, from what I understand, on my research on the case, was the coroner didn't find any instance of drugs or any alcohol in their system. So what the hell were they drugged with or incapacitated with? Rope or something? I mean, they didn't find any ligature marks. From what I understand, it's the craziest shit I've ever seen in my life. It's like they said it was a murder, but there's no proof that there was murder. I mean, there's proof that they froze to death. So
right. Now, the only thing the thing about Melquist is that he supposedly killed Bonnie Lee Scott through suffocation with a pillow. And they said that because, the bodies had been there almost a month, there was no way to rule out suffocation as a cause of death, but they couldn't point to that specifically. Because where it's strangled, there'd be bruise marks and ligature marks, like you said, on their neck. They weren't tied up. They weren't beaten. I did see something that said it appeared as though there were light bruising on the face, which initially they thought maybe they were beaten, but when they looked during the autopsy, the bruises didn't go further than skin deep, so it never hit any major tissues under the skin. So there wasn't the bruises weren't from beating marks, and so it kind of stood out because Melquist's thing was, and again, like I said, I don't think he acted alone, but with Melquist, his thing was rendering women unconscious. and he would use a hold that he learned in the military. And so there were, girlfriends, past girlfriends of him that would come forward after the Bonnie Lee Scott case or during the case and say, oh yeah, I used to go out with Chuck, and one minute I was sitting next to him, and the next minute I was waking up and looking up at him. So he had a very quick way of rendering women unconscious using some sort of hold, which really didn't leave any marks other than some pockmarked bruising the next day, because anytime you cut off the air, the blood flow to the head, it causes this kind of like a rash. It looks like a red rash on your face. It's a very small bruising capillary. Capillaries are broken just underneath the skin, which may have showed up, on the bodies later on would look like bruising after they've been dead for a while. And it is kind of a bruising. They're capillaries, small capillaries that erupt, and probably wouldn't have had a whole lot of time to form because the bruising wouldn't have been able to go too far, because if they were unconscious when they were left, which of course they would freeze a lot, die of hypothermia a lot faster if they were unconscious rather than alive. Because first of all, if they were, one theory was that they froze to death. Well, everyone tested, even though the temperatures were pretty cold that night, if they were conscious and moving, even if they were unclothed, it would have taken between 8 to 10 hours to actually freeze to death, in which case their food would have fully digested. So that whole theory goes out the window. So they would have had to have been at least unconscious at the time, which of course then would lower your body temperature even more. Kind of like when you're asleep, the last thing you want to do if you're going through hypothermia is fall asleep, because your body temperature drops. So that could have been, it could have figured in. They wouldn't be able to rule it out if Mellquist had done the same thing he did to Bonnie Lee Scott.
There was another parallel case to this, and it's one you did actually mention briefly during the Gacy episode we did, and that was the Schuessler-Peterson murders.
Sure.
Talk about the parallel there.
Sure. Well, Schuessler-Peterson, it was three young boys. Two were brothers, and one was a friend, and they had gone to a movie theater, kind of like the Grimes girls had, and they weren't seen from again. And their nude bodies were found. These were three boys' bodies were found near Roberts Woods, the Forest Reserve, which is more or less on the northwest side of Chicago, a little closer to the O'Hare Airport. But this was in 1955, so when it was very fresh in everyone's memory. At the time the Grimes girls went missing, although from a totally different neighborhood. And that made news because when the bodies were found, it wasn't so much a parallel. I mean, the bodies were dumped in a wooded area, similar to the Grimes case. They were male, not female, so that's a big difference. The other big difference is that the boys had definitely been beaten, strangled, and tied up, and there were tons of marks on the boys, so they knew exactly how they died. They died in a very violent fashion, which was totally different from the Grimes case. But that again went unsolved for a long time. It wasn't until Helen Brock disappeared in the 90s that they actually had someone that was eventually charged in the crime, and that was Ken Hansen. And Ken Hansen was a stable hand for Silas Jane, Silas Jane was a horrible person. He was somewhat mobbed up. He was also very violent. He had his brother killed, but was never charged with the murder. I think he did a short time for conspiracy to commit murder, but he was never charged with his brother's murder. But he was just, and Silas Jane liked young girls. And so, but his big thing was ripping people off in the horse trade. So Silas Jane would raise these, nothing horses and then sell them to people with money as these, great thoroughbred horses. But Helen Brock was one of his clients, and she figured out what Silas Jane was doing, and then she disappeared. And so when ATF was involved in the investigation of the Helen Brock disappearance, an ATF informant came forward and said, I don't know anything about Helen Brock, but I can tell you who killed